you bring good news. Well, you know that you'll talk about a topic that is very dear to our hearts. Let's see. Let's let's see what you can tell. Okay, let's give it just one more minute. So some people will join us and okay, I think we're already live on YouTube. So in respect of everyone who showed up on time, let's start. I'll just switch to Spanish again for 1 second. Para quienes necesiten interpretación al español, debajo hay como un... perdón, sorry, I listened to the interpreter. Para los que necesiten interpretación en español, se pueden pasar al canal que abajo, elegir español y escuchan a nuestro intérprete. I'll switch to English now. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Sorry. Okay, that's it. Sorry, because I was listening to the interpreter. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for being here and welcome to... Sorry, we have an issue. Sorry, we have... Jere, escucho a la intérprete hablándome... sorry, I did it now. Sorry, because that was going to be difficult. I'll start again. Sorry. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Rethinking Free Trade, the New Rules of Global Integration. Thank you for joining us from different time zones across the globe. My name is Federico Fernandez. I am the CEO of We Are Innovation, and I'll be your moderator today. We are honored and very happy to bring this discussion that we think is very timely about the changing landscape of global trade. This webinar is organized jointly by We Are Innovation and Fundación Internacional Bases. We Are Innovation is a global network of over 45 think tanks, foundations, and NGOs united in our belief that innovation drives progress and solutions to global challenges. Throughout our collective efforts, we work to advance human creativity and promote innovative solutions worldwide. Fundación Internacional Bases is an institution dedicated to advancing individual liberties and market economy principles. Inspired by Juan Bautista Alberdi's work, the foundation actively drives reforms through education, events, and research to promote freedom and prosperity across Latin America and beyond. Today, we have an exceptional panel of experts who will analyze how traditional models of global integration are being challenged by recent developments, from the new Trump-era policy to US-China tensions and the revival of industrial policy. I will introduce them very briefly, please, because they all have very long bios with a lot of achievements, and I think it will be boring if I read all of them, but just to give you an idea, in case you don't know them, who our speakers are. Veronique de Rugy, she's joining us from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where she serves as the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy. Steven Isel, he's the Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and we also cooperate with Steven at another project called GTIPA, which is a global network that promotes innovation and free trade. Oscar Guinea, he's a Senior Economist at ECIPE and a regular contributor to international media. And last but definitely not least, Stuart Patterson, he's a Senior Research Fellow at the Hinrich Foundation, and he brings 25 years of capital markets experience. For our Spanish-speaking audience, remember, you can change into Spanish. You can use the little icon there and change to Spanish and listen to the interpreter. The format for today's session will be as follows. Each of our speakers will deliver an opening presentation of 5 to 6 minutes, sharing their insights on how they see things with the particular focus in each case. And then there will be time for some Q&A. I encourage everyone who's joining us here on Zoom or also on YouTube. You can leave on in the Q&A box here or in the comment section on YouTube. Leave your questions. I'll do my best effort to try to take some of your questions to our speakers, as many as possible. We have a very strong policy of ladies first in We Are Innovation. So, Veronique, I would like to give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And let's start. So President Trump is back. And as you guys know, he has prided himself as being the tariff man. And his approach to trade is marked by several stated goals, which are often inconsistent and even in contradiction with one another. So for instance, on one hand, he claims he wants to reduce the trade deficit, bring manufacturing job back, bring foreign direct investment back. He wants to make trade fairer. He also wants to use tariffs as a bargaining tool against other nations to make trade fairer, but he also says that he wants to use tariffs to raise revenue and pay down the deficit. So there's just a lot of very ambitious objective that the tariff man has, and I believe that they're often misguided and extremely inconsistent. So for instance, if you just talk about reducing the trade deficit, first, I have issues with the notion that somehow we should care more about the US trade deficit as we should care about your trade deficit with your grocery store. Now, I leave aside foreign policy issues and geopolitical issues. That's kind of one of the areas where I think even the most rabid free trader would agree that we can suspend some of the rules of free trade. But for the most part, the value that the Trump administration places on this notion of trade deficit, to me, doesn't hold water that much. The other problem also is that there is a vilification of imports, which is problematic from the perspective of an economist, because the real value of trade actually is import, right? Export for us is a cost. It's abstract from GDP. Export is what you is the price you pay for actually getting the stuff that you want. But there's also a more fundamental problem with a lot of this, is that it's a profound misunderstanding of the connection that exists between import and exports, right? I mean, like, people sell us stuff because they want to buy stuff from us. And what you see is a connection between, if you reduce import, you reduce both, you end up reducing both exports and foreign direct investment. So right there, you have a problem. The same is true of the goal of actually bringing back manufacturing to the country. If you bring back manufacturing in the form of tariffs, or if you attempt to, what you end up doing with such an integrated supply chain, you end up making the cost of inputs so expensive that it makes it really hard. Recently, I think I saw yesterday that he would like to renegotiate once again the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. What the NAFTA agreement did in the 90s was not so much, I mean, I think the people who were proponent of NAFTA just overstated what it would do, but what it ended up doing really, really well is creating a very integrated supply chain between Canada, Mexico, and the US. And this notion that he wants to renegotiate this because we want car manufacturer to be here is odd. For one thing, we have some of the biggest manufacturer, like for instance, we have BMW in South Carolina, and it's the biggest plant of the biggest plant we have. This is the one that brings the most value in terms of export in the US, but it's also one of the biggest plant that BMW has. And if you make these, since so much of, like, when you build a car, it's not all built here, even though this particular plant used 300 different domestic suppliers. They all use a lot of export, but also a lot of the cars that are built here by BMW are using inputs for engine, for instance, and particular leather from abroad, because those car manufacturers, they want some homogeneity between their product around the world to preserve their brands. So if you want to bring car manufacturers here with tariffs, what you effectively do is make the price of building cars in America more expensive. There's, of course, also the notion that somehow we don't have foreign car manufacturers here. It's not true. We have many. We have Kia that opened up last year, invested billions of dollars to open a plant in the US. So anyway, let's kind of talk now. I mean, and I could go on about making trade fairer and things like this. It's like, I think there's just a lot of conflicting issues. And of course, by the way, in using trade and because it's a big debate, because I don't know if you guys are following, but this year we have an enormous fiscal inflection point, because the Trump part of the Trump tax cuts of 2017 are going to expire. And in order to renew them, you have to kind of offset some of them. So the deficit, which is enormous already, and our debt, which is growing really fast, doesn't explode. So a lot of the American first advocates and including President Trump, have actually talked about raising revenue with tariffs in order to pay for the tax cuts. The problem with this, of course, is if you believe that tariffs are effective to preventing imports, it means that you're not going to raise that much revenue if the policy really works. So there's just a lot of inconsistency. So let's talk about what has happened since President Trump was inaugurated on Monday, right? I think the country was bracing itself for tariffs across the board against China, but against our trading partners. It hasn't happened yet. And I think yesterday it was very clear that Wall Street was excited about the possibility that this was not going to happen. And the administration on day one has issued a lot of executive orders. And again, the surprise was that they weren't tariffs in the executive orders, the announcement of tariffs. They were the announcement of studying the tariffs. There's been already threat of tariffs imposed on Mexico and Canada starting on February 1st. And so there is a chance, there is a sense that maybe the president, though he's really a believer in old-fashioned protectionism, maybe he is being swayed by the argument of using tariffs more as a way to extract the kind of things that he wants. I have doubts that this is where it's going to end up. I think ultimately he's made promises of big tariffs, and I think we're going to see big tariffs. I think there's a problem with using tariffs to negotiate non-economic or non-trade related concession from our trading partners. I think that, as we've seen during the first Trump administration, right, American consumers, whether they're producers or just final good consumers, are going to be shouldering the cost of whatever tariffs are put in place. Americans have demonstrated they do not like higher prices. I think the Democrats paid a heavy cost for the inflation that we've seen, and tariffs raised the price of the goods, whether they're input or final goods. I mean, and Americans are going to be the ones shouldering the cost. I think we're going to see retaliation, and that is going to be a big mess. And I think the literature is pretty clear that the Trump tariffs the first time around and the maintaining of those tariffs under the Biden administrations have not succeeded in achieving the goals that were announced, and certainly the trade deficit has not gone down in any way, shape, or form. So I will stop there. It's early. We don't know yet. There's President Trump likes conflict, so his administration is a mix of people who are free trader and talk a good game about only using tariffs as a way to extract concessions. But there are other people like Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller and a bunch of others who are like just really, really tariff believers. So we'll see which side of the ledger wins, and then we can get in during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Veronique. There are already some questions. Please, I encourage everyone to leave your questions on the Q&A box. And now I want, let's say, from Washington, D.C., I want to move back to Europe to give the floor to Oscar Guinea. Oscar, all yours.
Very much. So let me start with some statistics. The EU is a much more open economy than the US or China. Europe's trade to GDP ratio is 51%. Compared to 25% for the US and 37% for China. Therefore, the European economy is more dependent on external demand for its growth model, and that is something that is not going to change in the short to medium term. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, despite all the negative news about supply chains bottlenecks, protectionist measures, and trade wars, trade in goods and services was forecast to grow at 2.7% last year, which was in line with global GDP growth. And international trade allows countries to specialize and to access inputs from abroad, which supports productivity growth. But independently on whether you believe that trade is a source of Europe's strength or weakness, it is clear that Europe's openness conditioned its trade and economic policy. So let me break Europe's trade policy into three parts: the United States, China, and the rest of the world. With respect to the United States, Europe is bound to react to any tariff or threat of a tariff from the United States. However, the EU will not want to do that in a way that offers an excuse to future retaliation from the US. The EU enjoys a trade surplus in goods of 158 billion euros with the United States. But if you factor the trade surplus that the US enjoys over the EU in services, which is 71.2 billion euros, the potential for the EU to buy large amounts of US gas and oil, which will also help the EU economy to stop buying energy from Russia, and the likely increase in EU imports of defense equipment produced by US contractors, the EU has a good argument to convince the US administration that the trade relation across the Atlantic is more balanced than what it first meets the eye when you look at trading goods. But it is also clear to me that if the US imposed tariffs on the EU will retaliate as it did during the first Trump administration, and thus that's not good for anyone. With respect to China, the EU will follow an assertive policy which has already been applied for some time. So, for instance, last year, the EU imposed additional import tariffs on Chinese electric cars and batteries. True, they were not as large as US tariffs, but they were still between 20 and 40% on top of the existing 10% tariffs. And last week, the EU found that China discriminates against EU producers of medical technology products in Chinese public procurement and is ready to impose similar restrictions to Chinese producers using a new legislation called the International Procurement Instrument. The EU and the US share many concerns with respect to China, and that was clearly visible in the work of the Trade and Technology Council, which was an EU-US forum that was put in place by the Commission and the Biden administration. But sharing similar concerns doesn't mean that the EU will follow the US policy with respect to China. The EU will make its own decisions on China, and these decisions will be made in a case-by-case basis. And with respect to the rest of the world, the EU will follow a strategy that is influenced by its policy towards China and towards the US, and the fact that the EU is an open economy. It will look for ways to get additional market access for its exports, as well as secure access and diversification for its imports. And the example of this strategy are the conclusion of the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement and the update of its trade agreement with Mexico. And both agreements, which had been on the making for years and years, they were concluded in less than a month. The agreement with Mercosur, which includes, as some of you already know, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and the agreement with Mexico offers the EU access to its exports and diversification of imports with trade partners like the EU will value a rule-based international trade system. So, for instance, in the case of Mercosur, we're talking about an agreement that offers the EU access to a market of almost 300 million people, annual savings on import tariffs of 4 billion euros, and preferential access to Mercosur public procurement and raw materials. And the agreement with Mexico, which is an economy larger than Australia, offers similar advantages. I'm not going to be overly optimistic because these trade agreements, they need to be approved by the European Council, which are the EU member states, and the European Parliament, and this will not be easy, particularly the agreement with Mercosur due to the opposition from Europe's agriculture and environmental lobbies. But the agreement has sufficient safeguards and mechanisms to avoid any significant increase in Mercosur agriculture exports that could really hurt European farmers. Interestingly, and this is my final point, it is probably the protectionist policies from the US which could galvanize support for the ratification of these agreements and others. I mean, the combination of market losses for EU agricultural products in the Chinese market and potential losses in the US markets, and the calls for the EU to demonstrate that countries can cooperate and arrive to mutual beneficial rule-based outcomes. I mean, that could make the small losses that these agreements may impose on some EU agricultural products less of an issue in the future debate about EU trade policy.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you. And yeah, God save us from more Argentinian beef and Uruguayan beef in Europe. You know, that would be catastrophic. But now we go back to Washington, D.C., to Stephen, and we'll put our eye a little bit on Asia, and then with Stuart, we'll go in depth in Asia. But Stephen, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Federico, and thank you to VR Innovation and Fundación International Bases for the invitation to be with you today. So overall, I think we're in a state where the US-China geopolitical and trade tensions will continue to be a flashpoint under the second Trump administration. But it's going to be very interesting to watch the evolution of US trade policy towards China here. As you know, the administration got into action quickly on Monday, issuing on the first day over 50 official documents, which included 26 executive orders, and one particular memorandum outlining, quote, an America First trade policy that was addressed to multiple cabinet secretaries, although 9 of the 10 addressees aren't in position yet. And so what was interesting about this memo was that despite promises on the campaign trail to introduce a slew of tariffs on day one, the memo was largely measured, at least for the moment. In particular, in Section 3 of the memo, it called upon the United States Trade Representative's Office, USTR, to begin undertaking an assessment of a May report titled, from USTR, titled 4-Year Review of Actions Taken in the Section 301 investigation, looking at China's acts, policies, and practices related to tech transfer, intellectual property, and innovation. It called for USTR to investigate specifically how China's policies had affected America's industrial supply chain, how we were seeing circumvention of US tariffs through third countries, and called upon USTR to build a comprehensive list of all discriminatory Chinese acts and policies that hinder U.S. commerce or infringe on U.S. Intellectual property rights, and to have this on the president's desk by April 1st. Quite time frame, obviously, just 2 months away. But, you know, it was interesting. I think in the first 48 hours of this administration, the president has expressed a willingness to talk business with China. He suggested he'd be interested in going to China by the end of this year. He said yesterday that his greatest foreign policy goal of the second administration would be to be, quote, avoiding World War III. So it certainly seems that he is going to be examining trade and economic policy issues between U.S. and China in a foreign policy lens, and that makes sense given the state of global affairs, particularly the land war we see in Europe. So what we know more than anything else about Donald Trump is that he loves to make a deal. The man is all about the art of deal making. So policy is performance to him. And I think this is how we need to interpret a lot of the narrative around Trump. Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Zelina Zito famously said, "Most on the left take Trump literally, but not seriously. Whereas the proper way to understand Trump is to take him seriously, but not literally." I think this is why he threw out, 60%, tariffs on China throughout the campaign trail, and then nothing on day one. Now, all this said, let's talk tariffs. Last night, late in the evening, he came out and said, well, we are probably looking at beginning to impose 10% tariffs on China as early as February 1st, justifying this on what he sees as China's support for fentanyl and immigration coming into the United States. So overall, what's interesting, of course, on the tariff side to remember is that in the first administration, we put in place a series of tariffs on China. And last year, the United States imposed $205 billion worth of Chinese exports come into the U.S., 85 billion of which was applied at a 7.5% tariff level, and 120 billion in imports at a 25% level. In addition to this, the Biden administration put in place tariffs of 100% on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, 50% for semiconductors, 25% for lithium-ion batteries, and 100% for the solar photovoltaic panels. So there are a lot of tariffs starting in place. And then what we're talking about now is, does Trump put in place a blanket level of a 10% or 25% tariff on all Chinese products coming to the United States? It was very interesting last night, however, that he was talking about Chinese tariffs at 10%, whereas the tariffs he had in mind for Mexico and Canada were 25% for the same infraction. It was quite interesting to see that interpretation of how you approach allies versus adversaries. Just to Veronica's point, Navarro said over the weekend, quote, "Tariffs are tax cuts." And this is Orwellian to the extent of war is peace. Trump on the campaign trail said he wanted to collect $1 trillion in tariffs. And the reason they argue this would be a tax cut is because they say this is how we do finances as a pay for the tax cuts they want to do with the tax extenders. Let me just mention a couple other topics before I wrap up my remarks. Export controls. As you know, the Biden administration introduced a large number of export controls, particularly on U.S. exports of semiconductors and artificial intelligence products to China. This included an export control framework for artificial intelligence diffusion released earlier this month. That would actually, interestingly, cap, it would say each year how many GPUs do American firms produce, and it would cap at 50% the amount which we be permitted to export globally. Some of the caps in that diffusion framework are quite extensive, and we and others will push back on that significantly. But I think you'll see in general export controls continue. We're going to look at de minimis. Right now, there's a de minimis rule stating that exports coming into the United States that are $800 or less are not subject to tariffs. Trump's talking about bringing that de minimis rule down to $300. I think you'll see that happen. We need to be mindful that on December 23rd, the Biden administration announced a 301 investigation on Chinese semiconductor practices. So we may see a whole new slew of defensive measures around semiconductors, particularly legacy semiconductors, mature node semiconductors coming to the United States. And the last thing I'll say is that on Capitol Hill, there is a very serious conversation about revoking China's permanent normal trade relations with the United States. This, of course, is a legislation that gives China most favored nation status according to WTO rules. You got to make the best offer to China that you do to your trading partners. I think that if Trump asked for this from Congress, he'll get it, and it'll pass the House easily. Maybe not the Senate, but certainly as we see how this unfolds, looking at whether or not we go back to the old form of America applying MFN status in China conditionally on an annual basis based upon their behavior, I think will be very interesting. And I'll leave my remarks there for now.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And last but not least, Stuart, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I thought that last comment from Stephen was very interesting about permanent normal trade relations, because I think pretty much everything that the panelists have talked about so far have their origin in the granting of permanent normal trade relations back in 2000. And you know, when we look at how trade and the discussion around globalization has become infused with geopolitics and great power competition, I think that, you know, it was China's accession to WTO and in many ways their abuse of the global trading system that has led to the juncture that we find ourselves in now. And of course, you know, in many ways, China was pushing an open door. It's not necessarily where the blame lies. You know, our own politicians and trade gurus sat idly by while the freer trade regime was allowed to be exploited. But let me turn to Asia and comment a little bit about, you know, where we find ourselves now and what Trump 2 might mean for Asia. I mean, obviously there are 49 countries in Asia, and each of them have very different trade structures, very different trade agendas, different geopolitical alignments, different things that they bring to the table. If we remove China from the equation for a moment, I think two things are overriding. One is that it's becoming increasingly evident to a large number of Asian countries that China's rise has been anything but a boon for their own development and industrialization. In fact, in many ways, it's been very detrimental, that China's in many ways eaten their lunch in terms of the progress that they were making towards industrialization. And secondly, that China's narrative that, you know, they're going to be the fastest growing economy in the world, and therefore you better hitch your wagon to that horse because otherwise you'll be left behind, and all the sort of coercion that potentially goes with that narrative is starting to fall very flat for most people. The reason being that obviously China's marginal propensity to import is incredibly low and falling, and that once you exclude sort of minerals, mineral fuels and food, unless you're a country that's blessed with an over-endowment of those things, China's marginal propensity to import is practically zero. So the sort of long shadow of China's growth narrative over Asia is, in my view, starting to fall apart. And that is an opportunity for the United States in particular, but for the West more generally, I think, to increase its influence in the region. A window that was opened anyway by China's more assertive foreign policy and geopolitical maneuverings, particularly in the South China Sea, but in terms of border engagements in India, for example, and other places. So in many ways, I think the door is being opened, and there's an opportunity here for the United States, and that's why I think it's very important that this administration does draw a very distinct dichotomy between the rhetoric of politics and the actual implementation of policy. And, you know, again, Stephen and I think Veronique both alluded to that in terms of, you know, a lot of the electoral statements made in the heat of the moment at a large rally don't necessarily translate into policy action immediately. But I think so obviously Asia needs trade, you know, more than most regions, in the sense that, you know, outside of China, there are very few economies, you know, Japan's one, but that, you know, are really large enough to sustain the broad gamut of industries that a modern economy requires. And that's reflected in trade to GDP ratios across the region, which are substantially higher than world averages once you strip China out. Asia is bound together by a series of what's called a noodle bowl of trade agreements. They're plurilateral, there are bilateral agreements. The most important of which, I believe, is not the RCEP, the one that China dominates, but actually it's the CPTPP. And ironically, this is the thing that the Americans pulled out of when it was called just the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But actually, I think in many ways, what makes it so valuable at the moment is that there isn't actually a superpower in it. So it is a collection of middle powers who are actually interested in deepening trade agreements for the production of economic welfare and not so much for trying to achieve geopolitical goals. So I see CPTPP as acquiring greater importance going forward as the geopolitical tensions mount. And it gives Asian countries outside of China an opportunity to move away from the sort of Sino-centric trade order that China was trying to create through the RCEP agreement. I suppose the other points I want to make is that China is relatively well prepared for Trump too, I think, in the sense that what we've witnessed in the last few years has been a rise in China's exports to the United States via third countries. So it's Chinese content in Vietnam, Chinese content in Mexico that is being imported into the US. Trump's tariffs, which were obviously continued under the Biden administration, actually did work if your goal was to reduce bilateral trade engagement between the two countries. So if the goal was decoupling or setting the two countries along the road to an economic decoupling, I think it did work. The next step, obvious step, is if you're interested in reducing trade dependencies, and I think the United States quite rightly is very worried about strategic dependencies on China and other strategic competitors. The next step would be to go after Chinese content coming from third countries. And I think that's probably the most likely sea change in trade policy coming out of Washington that would make sense from a geopolitical perspective. It also makes sense for the third countries. In a way, it plays to their agenda too, because it gives them the opportunity to vertically integrate and create industry clusters within their own borders so that they're not simply assembly hubs for Chinese components. And things like the Inflation Reduction Act actually also sort of catalyzed this to a certain extent. I'm thinking here of sort of nickel coming out of Indonesia, which was basically Chinese nickel because it was Chinese investment that went to produce the smelters and exploit the mines. And because of the demands of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chinese ownership became a problem, and therefore it gives the Indonesians an opportunity to actually indigenize these industries somewhat. So I mean, I could go on about this, but we hear, in summary, what I would say is, we hear a lot about the irrationality of some of what Trump says, and I think we have to look a little bit beyond that and see where there are opportunities to deepen trade relationships, and I think that, and to put a global trading system on a more sustainable footing, because it certainly wasn't on a sustainable footing before Trump won. That China's abuses of the system were having a really debilitating impact on many economies, and we're muddling through to some kind of solution. But I think there's cause for some optimism as well as obviously angst, given the unpredictable nature of what we're dealing with.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And there are some questions, and if our audience wants to leave more, please do so. I have some of my own, and I want to start with you, Stuart, that patiently waited for everybody to speak. So I want to start with you. My question, and sorry, it's a little bit basic, but there has been a lot of talk recently of Vietnam becoming the new China, or something like that, or replacing China in a certain extent. You mentioned Vietnam briefly. What can you tell us about Vietnam and what's going on there?
So Vietnam can't replace China. No country can replace China, and I don't think that's the idea. Securitization of supply chains comes primarily through diversification, and it'll take multiple nodes of manufacturing excellence around the world to eat away at China's manufacturing dominance. But Vietnam has been very successful in ramping up its industrial manufacturing value added. Part of that is, well, in large part, it's down to multinational investment in Vietnam. The Koreans have been huge investors in Vietnam. So if you looked at Samsung Electronics, for example, the Samsung Group, without creating a big splash, have very successfully diversified away from China at a far faster pace than Apple is ever going to do, or any of these higher profile multinationals, higher profile in the Western sense. And then of course the Chinese themselves have been big investors into Vietnam as well. But Vietnam, just in terms of size, but also in terms of geopolitics, does not provide a solution. The solution lies in diversification. And so, Vietnam is one string to that bow, but it's not the bow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Veronique, I want to bring a question, the first question that was asked, that I think it's very interesting because, coming from a country like mine, Argentina, that has very protectionist tendencies, this is a topic that comes all the time, which is, the question is from Gustavo and says something like this: what trade deficit implies to many people is unemployment in the importer country. What can you say to people that fear this effect?
Unemployment in the importing country. Well, I mean, the problem with thinking that protectionism is going to be really helpful, right, comes from the fact that it's one that only focuses on the tariffs and the industry where the tariff is being implemented. So there's no doubt that with tariffs, you can protect an industry. Obviously, it is done at the cost of innovation, but at the cost of consumers. The problem is that this ends up having a consequence for the industries that are not protected and that are consuming that good in particular. And there are actually a lot of examples that it also fails to even protect the employment in the industry that being protected. For instance, take the Trump administration's steel and aluminum tariffs on during his first terms, right? We saw a reduction of the import to some an increase in the price basically of aluminum and steel at great cost to consumers of aluminum and steel. And for instance, if you're a producer of garbage disposal, that was an example that was given often, right? And you import metals to produce garbage disposals in the US, what you end up seeing is a shift toward importing more garbage disposals as opposed to raising. So then of course, what's the solution? Well, if you're a protectionist, you say, well, then you just you put a tariff on the import of garbage disposal, but that too has consequences, right? One of the things also that people fail to realize is how much of trade is between related parties. So basically between multinational, a majority of the trade that happens are between related parties. So take, for instance, this BMW factory in South Carolina. It's an enormous one, right? A lot of what it trades is between the US factory to other BMW factories abroad, from other factories abroad to the BMW at home. And that's an enormous share of trade. And as a result, what you end up doing when you're trying for the sake of employment in the US, you end up hurting employment in the US in various different ways that are less than straightforward, as when you just think, well, if I protect the steel makers, right, with a tariff, then their employment is going to be fine. They're just like, it's so much more complicated than it is. So I guess I would take, I think the answer is probably like, maybe yes, you can protect some jobs, but it will be at the expense of other jobs.
Can I just come in here? I think Veronique's absolutely right, of course, when she's talking about one industry, a particular industry, and particularly intermediate goods. I have some sympathy for the questioner. Or, I mean, he wasn't disclosing his views when it comes to dealing with a country that perennially runs trade surpluses of a huge size, right? So China's manufacturing trade surplus now is about 1.75% of global GDP, right? So and this isn't ephemeral. This doesn't rebalance over a cycle. This is structural. This is because China has put in place capacities in manufacturing which it could never hope to absorb itself through domestic demand. And that overall current account surplus that China runs is a function of its own unwillingness to consume. So it wants, as a deliberate policy, to overproduce, which means someone else has to underproduce, which means incomes elsewhere are going to be suppressed by that. And so I have 100% sympathy with Veronique's microeconomic arguments about the irrationality of protectionism. But this is a macroeconomic argument about what damage to the global economy takes place when you allow a participant in the global trading system as large as China to manipulate that system for its own gain.
So can I say just something? No, I agree with you. The question is, are tariffs the best way to address this question? And I actually think that there are ways to address overproduction that are better, like using the WTO would be a better way, except that the last two administrations have dismantled the ability of the WTO to or weakens the ability of the WTO to address these questions. It's all
well, I don't think the WTO was ever capable of addressing that question. The solution is to cut China out of the global trading system, and you can't do that overnight.
So
because when market economies interact with non-market economies, the market economies just get shaped by the activities of the non-market economies when you're dealing with this size.
But it's also kind of ignoring the fact that China, I mean, in this way of talking about China trade, it's not that I disagree with you that there's an issue there, but it's also, it tends to assume that there's no cost to China to having these policies. And the truth of the matter is that there's enormous shift in resources within China towards the subsidized industries at great cost. And this notion that this is not only forever sustainable or profitable is, in my opinion, problematic, right? Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a cost. These policies don't have a cost on other countries.
They have huge costs, yeah.
But
the issue there is with the political economy of China, because the costs are borne by the consumer and the party state really don't care very much about the consumer. Party state care most about
I'd
maintaining
argue
power.
that the Trump administration doesn't care very much about consumers either, because these policies are going to
Wouldn't
be.
conflate a liberal democracy with
No, I
a
mean,
totalitarian state. Yeah.
It's not, I'm not conflating the two, but the truth of the matter is that the protectionist policy that the Trump administrations want to put in place, no matter what one thinks of the goal, right? Which like China's a problem. I mean, there's just like, there are many different ways. And again, I stated from the beginning that actually there are geopolitical and even national security reasons to suspend, a free trade policy, right? But it still remains that it's all about trade-offs, and denying that the cost of these policies to address a particular problem is going to be shouldered by consumers, as long as we're totally honest about this, and that President Trump can't have it both ways. He can't say on one hand, we're going to lower prices, we're going to do all of these things, and we're going to fight China with this particular means. I think I would be more comfortable saying we're going to fight China with tariffs and with these particular measures, but no, there will be a cost to consumers, and there's a price, to pay. So it's just the inconsistency is what really bothers me.
Thank you, Veronique, and thank you, Gustavo, who I know and made a very interesting question clearly, and thank you, Stuart. Really very interesting, clash of different views. Oscar, if you wanted to 30 seconds, and then we switch to no. Okay, I have a few more questions. I'll go with Oscar first. You mentioned briefly, but if you could, you let's say you work for an institute based in Brussels. What do you think? What do you think are the main hurdles that the Mercosur, the European Union agreement, will have to jump over in order to be ratified? And let's say, if I may ask, and please, you don't reply if you don't feel comfortable, which percentage of likelihood of being ratified you would give to the agreement?
Good. So in terms of the agreement, I will talk from the EU side. In order so the way it works is that the text has been concluded, has been negotiated, and now it needs to be passed by the European Council, which are the EU member states, and the European Parliament. It will go to the European Council. For that, let's say that for it to be blocked, you will need that EU governments representing more than 35% of the EU population will have to be against. And that's basically France, Poland, and someone else. So there is a possibility that other countries will be against the agreement and oppose. Having said that, the agreement is good for all the EU countries, not just, let's say, for Spain and Portugal, that you will think that have a stronger trading relationship with the Mercosur. In fact, actually, France and Germany are way larger exporters to the Mercosur countries than Spain and Portugal. And let's assume that that they pass by the Council, then it will need to be passed by the European Parliament. And then in the Council and the Parliament, there are basically two, let's say, stakeholders that will be against. One is the agricultural lobby, and the other is the environmental one. But in terms of, for the environment, for those who care about the planet, the agreement includes the Paris Agreement so if Brazil, Argentina, or a EU country will leave the Paris Agreement, then the agreement is no longer valid, and that will impose a penalty on leaving the Paris Agreement. So that's kind of a good one for those who care about the environment. And for those who care more about the agriculture side of the EU, it has to be said that the EU is one of the largest exporters of food and agricultural products, and it will benefit from the agreement. There will be some parts that will not benefit the agreement, particularly beef and poultry. But for those sectors in the EU, has to be said that the quota negotiated is lower than is actually trade, so the impact on trade will be low. There are safeguards, and the EU has promised a 1 billion fund to compensate losers from the agreement. Now, if I will have a crystal ball in terms of what's the likelihood of all this being passed, which we will discuss it for the next, we'll be discussing for the next year, I will be more optimistic than pessimistic, I think. But a lot of it will depend also, as I said on my initial remarks, on how the international environment is and how much the EU can really galvanize support in terms of the positives of the EU-Mercosur agreement from a geopolitical point of view and from the point of view of demonstrating that you can gather countries and produce and deliver an agreement that is good for everyone and is rule-based.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you very much. And Stephen, somebody just left on the chat a question. Alain, he says he's from Canada, and the question asks, "What do you think Trump will gain, or what will he ask from US and Mexico renegotiating the USMCA?"
Yeah, I think on that question, he does, care deeply about immigration as a particular issue, and that implicates Mexico more than Canada, and the same on the fentanyl issue. So yeah, I think this is a situation where geopolitics are going to get deeply connected to trade, because it's a place where, frankly, Donald Trump has leverage over these two particular trading countries. There'll be some other stuff. Investor-state dispute settlement, renegotiating the USMCA is going to be very significant. Re-importation is going to be very significant. If 100% US tariff on an electrical vehicle applies to an export of a WeLion battery or a BYD car from China, well, then that 100% export of that tariff needs to apply whether or not that vehicle is coming from a BYD factory in Guadalajara or Morocco or China. So the extension of some of these US defensive trade measures to third-party nations via instruments like the USMCA, I think will be very important. The deal was to have a 6-year term to be renegotiated in 2026. Trump has called for moving those negotiations up to right now. He has said that these 25% tariffs would apply starting on February 1st. So clearly he wants to maneuver our Canadian and Mexican friends into having to renegotiate these issues much more quickly than certainly they would like. Can I just throw out one more different topic here before we close, because I think it's important. I would quite frankly deem the behavior of the Biden administration regarding trade policy in its final year as shameful. And I use that word with specificity and intent, particularly as it relates to the United States pulling out of the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce at the WTO, and then also after 4 years of stringing our Asian allies along with the IPEF, pulling out of that because we didn't like our own digital trade policies. Not an instance of the US leading the way on higher global trade standards. I would like to see the Trump administration at least get us back in the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. IPEF is probably a dead letter in the new administration. What the administration has signaled that it might possibly be open to negotiating a trade agreement with the United Kingdom, something the Biden administration didn't even entertain for a half a millisecond. Other countries like Kenya have been suggested as possible FTA partners. Market access, market opening has been a dead letter in Washington for the past 8 years. It would be nice if we could get at least a rethink that there are good deals to be had with countries that are genuinely committed to the principles of free and fair trade.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 2 minutes technically. Let's try to fit a few more questions quickly, and then I'll beg you for short answers. I know it's difficult. Stuart, somebody on the chat wrote a long thing. I'm trying to summarize it as best as I can, but suggested the idea that whether we could see, given that there are so many tensions between the US and China, we could see something like a WTO, but for other, but not BRICS. I'm just saying countries that are not US and China. And you mentioned at the beginning what used to be the Trans-Pacific Agreement. seems to be going, maybe, no, better said, maybe is going in that direction. Do you think would be likely that, other countries of the world try to, let's say, preserve free trade rules and free trade and excluding the US and China in certain ways, at least?
Well, I mean, small economies need trade, right? I mean, they thrive on trade. If the world moved to autarky, the US economy would suffer, but it wouldn't suffer dramatically in comparison to smaller economies. So smaller economies have more at stake. The US, in terms of the sort of structure of WTO, was hugely magnanimous in the early stages of the World Trade Organization's formation, because it was giving up huge amounts of negotiating leverage in the name of this multilateral organization and MFN and what have you. So I do believe that the smaller countries will coalesce around agreements, countries that actually really do need to trade, and to my mind, that's great, beneficial, so long as they're market-orientated economies, or if they're not, they're not of a size that enables them to distort markets in other countries. And China wasn't unique in being a non-market economy, but what made it unique was its size and the speed with which it mobilized its resources, and that was, I'm afraid, very, very destructive. And efforts to get it to reform through 20 years or so of WTO membership and whatever just didn't work. And that's because of the political structure of China. The party state are not going to allow consumer sovereignty and profit maximizing capital allocation to take place in China. So that's the elephant in the room in terms of the global trading system, I think.
Thank you very much. Veronique, more a political question. It used to be, at least from outsiders, that you saw that it seemed like Republicans were more for free trade and Democrats not so much. Is there like a realignment? Are there any voices in politics for free trade in the US right now? What can you tell us about that?
It's an interesting question. There's definitely a realignment that is happening. I will tell you, when President Trump was elected the first time around, I did not expect the realignment and the Republicans to actually echo so quickly his protectionist talks, and yet it's happened. I also think that a lot of people now are comfortable with the idea of using protectionist policy as a means to target China, but remain uncomfortable with the idea of using protectionism as a kind of a run-of-the-mill industrial policy type goal, with industrial policy types goal. So there's definitely a realignment. There is you see it when you watch TV. If you watch Fox Business, if you watch, there's definitely something that's taken for granted. You see a lot of free market, free trade people who are more comfortable than they were before, saying, well, we're okay with this because he wants to use the tariffs or whatever measures as a means to negotiate a better deal. I think that two things will happen. I think we're going to see more of an alignment behind these policies in the short term, and in the longer term, it remains to be seen what results they have. Right? If they result in much higher prices, now the question is to be able to kind of, track down the cause of the higher prices. But the first time around, right? Economists have written a lot of studies about who shouldered the cost of the tariffs, and it's unclear. Trade is not an enormous. No matter how much we trade is at the center of everything we're talking about these days. It's actually a small share of the U.S. economy. So ultimately, even if you mess that up to the extent that you're good on tax policy, you do deregulate, the impact will be more muted than if it was an enormous part. Same thing, trade with China and the US is actually a very small share of our much smaller than people think of our imports, right? We talk about it as if it's like 70%. It's not. I think it's 10 or 15% tops. So now it's a big share, but it's not what people think. So whether people turn against protectionism is going to depend on how visible the impacts are, whether it's successful. Listen, I will say this. I believe that President Trump, there's something about him that he may be very successful in getting the kind of concession he wants from others in a way that other politicians couldn't do it. Whether that's good to have these type of conflictual relationship, that's a question that I will leave for someone else. But so I think we are in a period, at least in the medium term, of America being much more protectionist for sure.
Thank you very much, Veronique. Oscar, quickly, from the European EU perspective, who do you think within the Union will be the winners and losers if things with China continue to escalate, tariffs and then counter tariffs and things like that? I know, for instance, the automakers are very much worried about, the possible retaliations from China for other, tariffs that, and measures that the European Union is implying. How do you see that?
With China, you are asking, right?
EU-China, yeah.
Well, on the EU-China front of viewpoint, and I will be very brief because we are just about to end, is Germany. And Germany has let's say, over-reliance on, its economy. It really depends on exports as a growth model. And a lot of German exports go to China. And at the moment, during the last years, it has benefited because the way, the profile of German exports were supporting Chinese manufacturing and Chinese increasing the value added. And now it finds itself into a position where a lot of Germans' exports are competing also with Chinese exports. And the automaker sectors of cars are clearly an example of this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Germany seems to be in a complicated situation, definitely. And Stephen, and final question, and again, thank you for your time. Thank you for staying a few more minutes over the time I asked you. A question from my colleague Beatriz. If protectionism, if tariffs actually go up in the US, let's say, and this protectionist sentiment goes up, do you see it impacting, positively or negatively in innovation, in entrepreneurship? It could be maybe some short-term gains for long-term pain. How do you see that?
Well, I think it depends entirely on the meritoriousness of the tariff policy applied. Let's look at the solar panel industry. In 2006, China produced 2% of the world's solar panel production. By last year, it was over 85%. Chinese competition, which was supported by $42 billion of subsidies to that industry between 2012 and 2013 alone, knocked out over 500 Western firms. They destroyed that industry. They destroyed that industry's ability to innovate and be entrepreneurial in the West. In that case, I think tariffs to defend that industry would have supported innovation. Now, if we're talking about 25% tariffs on Mexico or Canada, and we recognize that we've built supply chains that, for instance, medical devices 10 times across these three countries' borders as a medical device goes to final production, 8 times for a car, then I think these tariffs are going to be very disruptive to people who want to create innovative medical devices in those industries, because the tariff is not really dealing with a true non-market or practice or economic problem. to quote Bill Clinton, tariffs should be used safe, effectively, and rarely. And only in cases where you're really responding to a foreign nation's unfair trade practice. The notion that some form of blanket 10% global tariff is going to help American innovators, I don't subscribe to that. Far more effectual policies will be tax credits for R&D or robust public funding programs for science and R&D. So I think to answer succinctly, I think tariffs can only support entrepreneurship and innovation when used in a defensive measure against unfair practices.
Veronique, Oscar, Stuart, Stephen, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to share this conversation with you. And everyone who is watching this or will watch this, follow this gentleman and lady on social media. Check the organizations they work for: Mercatus Center, ECIPE, the Hinrich Foundation, and ITIF and GTIPA. They all do an amazing work regarding trade, regarding innovation, so regarding economics. So please be in touch with them and follow them, because they're doing an amazing job. Thank you very much, and hopefully we can have another discussion about these topics soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico.